we could tell for lots of reasons that it's been a success and people are getting to know one another and bond, but not least of all because you're turning up late for everything now and going over your allotted time. Familiarity, you see. One confession of mortification, when we sent the program to the printers, they had to resize between US. It was designed in the US by a very devout Vietnamese Christian. As soon as we told him Peter Pham was on the panel, he agreed to do it for free. And then it was printed in Italy, so it moved from one size to another size. And in the resizing, Elaine Padilla was squeezed to the point of being invisible on today's session. But on the website, and as you can see, Elaine Padilla is very much here, and we're delighted that she is here. So our deepest apologies for that. Second, Tina Beattie wants to make a brief announcement, but I can't see Tina, so okay. So Tina will make a very brief announcement, and then we will begin.
Sorry, the coffee queue was too long. I just wanted to draw your attention to an event that's happening at the University of Roehampton in the southwest of London from the 10th to the 12th of September this year on women, authority and leadership in Christianity and Islam. The format is we have 2 days of academic conference, and the third day is for community groups and representatives of churches and mosques in and around London to come and have dialogue with the academics. If you're interested, I've left literature on the table out there. You can oh sorry, I'm out of breath. I did hurry to get here. You can email me at the University of Roehampton, and I can also send you information as an attachment. And I'd be very grateful for any publicity anybody can give to this. Someone said, are men allowed to come? Everyone is welcome, providing they leave their authority at the door. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I know this is a graveyard session, but please don't make it too obvious. Welcome to this session. We have outstanding presenters before us. And at least this is a balanced session. You can see gender-wise, we are doing fine this afternoon. Regional-wise, maybe we can improve on that. But so this afternoon, we will start with our sister Mary McClintock-Foxon. Sorry, but many people mispronounce my name and I forgive them. And she is going to talk about difficult dialogue and wisdoms about difference, doing as a way of knowing. Mary is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church of USA. She is also a professor of theology at Duke University Divinity School. Some of her books include Changing the Subject, Women's Discourses and Feminist Theology, on Non-Feminist Church Women. Interesting, that one we should buy. And the Oxford Handbook of Feminist Theology, which she co-edited with S. Briggs on globalization. So let's welcome Mary with a clap of a hand, and then if she impresses us afterwards, we'll clap for her again.
Okay. Doing as a way of knowing is a phrase I got from Sharon Welsh, who was originally going to be the speaker. So I'm going to invoke her thinking, and this is just my expansion of that. Clearly, this has been a place where lots of wisdoms about difference have been brought together, and I'm extremely grateful. But I want to talk a little bit about why resolving differences may not be the only desired end, and I want to sort of explore this idea. First of all, I'm going to talk about different kinds of wisdoms. First of all, academics, my primary site for wisdom. The dominant approach in the academic world in the West is typically defined around the debate model. Now, of course, academics is good. It's about gaining new knowledge. But the medium as debate is basically about winning an argument. This is most clearly seen in what counts as academic publications, where the frequent approach would be an argument that so-and-so's Christology is too low or wrong, patriarchal, whatever, and here's my version, which fixes those mistakes and is the winning version. You deal with difference by proving that you are smarter, that you get the problem, whatever it is, and that you can resolve it better than your academic competition. I don't want to discredit this field, I do it. Of course, academic work can reveal crucial knowledges about the world, like how to reframe reality in a way that exposes and addresses dominant blindnesses. It facilitates new insights into reality. I'm thrilled when the winner in a debate over the most effective treatment for cancer, I'm thrilled with their results. Now, philosopher Anthony Appiah offers a helpful definition of theory that's relevant here. Theory is practices that discern patterns in reality, patterns that generate new insights. Patterns in social behavior, biology, human violence, etc. As a theoretical discernment, he argues, a pattern necessarily tolerates falsehoods, the elements of reality that don't fit the pattern. If you were attending to every detail in reality, nothing like a pattern would appear, he says. So theories are crucial. We must discern patterns. However, they cannot be absolutized or forever fixed. Again, the question is not whether a theory excludes some reality. A theory always tolerates falsehoods. The question is, when do the falsehoods become intolerable? When, for example, does defining normative human being around the model of a white Western male, when do the falsehoods it tolerates become intolerable? An example, defining sin as pride and egotism, as Reinhold Niebuhr and numerous other Western white theologians did, that has some truth, but when you give attention to women who are subjected to long-term abuse, and you limit sin to pride or self-centeredness, this falsifies in intolerable ways. Attention paid to abused women who are taught not to be self-promotional but deny yourself and take up the cross, that's simply intolerable and needs correction. So, academic discernment is important and sometimes crucial to correct intolerable falsehoods. But where do we discern these falsehoods? Academic attention to difference also has some inadequacies. I want to appeal to a scholar, Todd Whitmore, a white Western scholar, who's doing ethnography in Africa. He says, theology as it's practiced today is largely, one might say almost entirely, a discipline of texts. Yet in sub-Saharan Africa, where he is working, there are 153 million people who do not read and write. He says just reading books about them does not begin to be adequate. Now, I'm going to come back to that. Let me compare then debate to dialogue. In contrast to debate, where the goal is successful argument of my position over against that of my opponent, the goal of dialogue is increased understanding of myself and others. In debate, my listening is to counter or disprove what I hear, rather than to understand the other. In debate, I listen for weaknesses so as to discount and devalue the other position. But in dialogue, I listen for strengths in order to affirm and learn from the other. Finally, in debate, I critique others' experiences as distorted or invalid. But in dialogue, I accept others' experiences as real and valid for them. The contrast is clear. Dialogue is rooted in honoring the other, honoring differences as we are able. And there have been lots of examples of that honoring in dialogue throughout this conference, but I only have 15 minutes, so I can't recite them. Dialogue at its best, then, signifies an intentional and deeply informed, important form of respect for the other. At its best, dialogue is not an effort to win, but to deepen understanding of myself and others. However, as humane as it sounds, dialogue has its limitations as well. There are other complexities of difference that need attention. There are deeply embedded forms of difference, differences related to brokenness that may not be addressed by respectful dialogue either. And the limitations of this are caused or contributed to by our subject positions. Our subject positions, such as our class, race, ethnicity, gender, other features of our social location. It was argued earlier by one of us that what remains divisive is avoidance of the prophetic character of faith and the need to foster prophetic communities. But our subject positions not only have a great deal of impact on our inclination to be prophetic, but also what we are prophetic about. Because our subject positions deeply affect what we are able to notice. And here Whitmore's example again. The 153 million sub-Saharan Africans whose communication skills are not reading and writing, they have wisdoms, but they're typically off the Western theologians' radar. Now, I could use examples in the US of people whose wisdoms are off our radar too, and reading books about this doesn't necessarily alter it. So what initiates us into that? And here I'm drawing on Sharon Welsh, a crucially important approach to religion calls attention to the wisdom of doing as a way of knowing. Now, lifting up doing as a way of knowing means all sorts of things, and there have been so many examples of that at this conference, examples of doing as a way of knowing. And this wisdom comes from all over the place. But my first example is going to be doing as a way of knowing as a challenge to the assumption that religion is adequately defined as beliefs, an account that by many scholars has been ascribed to Western notions of religion, which have been falsely universalized. To define religion as beliefs can imply that we reserve differences simply through intellectual discussion of common and divergent beliefs. However dialogical and respectful of the other this is, the idea that religion is a system of beliefs assumes, as Sharon says, that the goal is assessing beliefs between religions and finding overlaps and disagreements on basic concepts. While there are clearly benefits to this approach, it still seems to prioritize a kind of rationality and assume that the main feature of human nature is the capacity to think and reason. Such an account of religion as defined by beliefs is also charged with misdefining and sometimes excluding such so-called religions as Buddhism, about which I know very little, but Welsh has argued with others that there are Buddhist practices that have been defined as four ennobling truths, which have been falsely westernized into propositions to be believed rather than challenges to act. Instead, she argues that doing as a way of knowing invites attention to wisdoms that come with years of disciplined practices, injunctions to act in a particular way. Understanding anguish leads to letting go of craving, which leads to realizing its cessation, which leads to cultivating the path. There are many other examples of this. What we need, argues Welsh, is not new theories, but timely practices, disciplines, and aesthetics that can enable us to perceive the world and our place in it differently. Practices that can enable us to bear rage, pain, loss, that open our minds to that which is fitting, beautiful, and audacious. There are many examples of this in Christian traditions. Brad suggested attentiveness, discernment, and witnesses as spiritual practices. The Franciscan dialogue was full of practices such as this. As an extension of such mindfulness and spiritual disciplines, I want to stress a second form of wisdom that comes from doing, the discipline of receiving from the other. By that I mean practices of engagement with groups who are not like us. This kind of doing as a way of knowing requires that I, as a white privileged female, move out of a position of privilege and power and control and experience reality from another social location than my own as a white Westerner. There is no simple way to do this. I did some work, academic work in the US on the racial homogeneity of Protestant churches. Our typical white churches assume beliefs that we welcome all, that we are colorblind. However, only about 6% of evangelical churches in the US are significantly interracial, and 2.5% of mainline churches. So the dominant correct Christian beliefs, being inclusive, are at odds with our lived reality, our doing. The colorblindness is now being called a new form of racism, even though most of us whites define racism as a malicious individual act. And racist issues were resolved with law. However, I don't want to reduce racism to the black-white binary either. There are clearly many multiple axes besides that black-white binary. There are pejorative terms in the US for Asian Americans. Chinks, slant eyes are two that I found as I read, not an experience. Latinos, spics, wetbacks. In other words, this is not just a black-white issue. But Christianity is no longer primarily a North American phenomenon. It makes no sense for attention to difference in the white churches in the US to continue to be hanging out with people like myself. So, what are the possibilities for changing social location so that my knowing through doing could be altered? This is a very complex question. There are always strategies of avoidance that come with being human. I was part of an African American community for 13 years before honest conversations about race occurred. And they began, as I've told some of you, with a project about recovering the social, racial history of a particular African American woman who became the first ordained African American Episcopal priest. Her story has been used to generate honest conversations between us about our own family histories. Now, the difference between such conversations and the ongoing niceness of typical church-going has been astonishing to me and suggestive of crucial features of dealing with difference that many churches have ignored or avoided. Honest stories told by persons in ongoing face-to-face relationships can have a very different effect than academic learning and knowledge and reading books about race issues. And I mean here something like the playing out of reciprocity in an ongoing face-to-face community, accountability, space for confession, for mutual respect, for honesty, and gradually altering our stereotypes of one another. This is not simply beliefs. This is about ways of being, of doing. connected to deeply embedded fears, guilt, and resentment on the part of whites, and bias that shape us, and shape us differently, obviously. Again, I'm emphasizing the deeply embedded cultural, racial, class stereotypes that shape this behavior, and they're not fixed by correct beliefs. Before I started participating in this interracial church, I remember one night responding to some African American teenage boys in a parking lot with fear, despite my beliefs. And I realized later, as I thought about this, that my images for African American teenage boys came from the TV and news. I had not experienced them as church-going teenage boys, like white teenage boys that I had seen in my life. I had to be habituated into seeing them differently. That's my point. Up? Oh, time up. Okay, I was going to go on and talk then about other ways to be engaged in practices that are long-term, they're complicated, there's no easy quick fix, but this is about caring about the other and receiving from the other. So, in conclusion, I can't be changed by difference simply by reading books about it, writing about it, or even having some respectful dialogue. Something more risky has to happen over a long period of time. I have to change. I have to have a stake in it. How to contribute to making difficult dialogue possible? Wisdoms about difference definitely include debate, discernment of patterns that really matter, patterns that change prominent forms of blindness, but these aren't enough. Discernment is limited by our social privilege and location. Even if we can learn about outsiders without ongoing complex relations to the other, we can really fail to see. And this is a learned art, requiring more than discussions. It is never finished, requires support, forgiveness, and willingness to fail and start over.
Thank you so much, Mary. And seeing the reality of our afternoon that, as I said, is a grave session, I think I want us to focus on what Mary has presented and to ask questions of clarification if we have any, and engage a bit for 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. Doing as a way of knowing. Yes, okay. Do we have any sprinters who can run with the...
Hi, Catherine Reinhardt. Perhaps this is what you did not get to, but I appreciate what you said about needing to change your context in that doing is what will help you to know. How can particularly white people and people that have privilege avoid being tourists in other cultures? It just strikes me that there is a larger structural problem that just individual encounter with otherness can't fix.
That's a wonderful observation. Oh, thank you. Absolutely. I mean, it was partly a time thing. I mean, my biggest fear from the very beginning was that I was being a tourist. But you have to think in terms of other options besides the kind of behavior that I have engaged in. This is certainly not, one of the things I've worried about a whole lot is, okay, Mary, what are you going to get all white people to go visit African American churches? I mean, that's really obnoxious. There are reasons for the African American churches to be racially homogeneous. There are reasons for that are very different from the reasons that most of our white churches are homogeneous. I'm simply trying to raise this, as an example, and in here, things I didn't have time to say, is inviting other strategies besides this. IF, Industrial Areas Foundation, was one of the other examples I was going to talk about. That's where you don't even have to belong to a church, but you can be involved in working together. Brad Hines gave a paper on this the very first day, and there are ways to engage with other people where even the focus isn't necessarily on race. It's about what do we have in common? What do we have a shared stake in? But I am talking about long-term relationships where you are struggling for things together. So that would simply be another example. But you're right. I'm so glad you asked that.
Two more questions. Any? Yeah. Oh, okay. We start, yes, at the back, and then we come to Nansu.
Is this working now? Okay, yes, it is working. My name is Brianne Jacobs. I have a question. If you could nuance for me what you were saying about texts. You were talking specifically about academic texts, I think. But I was wondering about, for example, my own personal experience. When I walk down the street, I will always be a white woman. Nothing will change that. But after reading, I can name 10 fiction books off the top of my head. I don't speak the same way after reading Beloved or The Color Purple or the autobiography of Malcolm X. Those allowed me, in a way, not to be a tourist, but at the same time to radically understand myself differently. So I was wondering if you could nuance what you were saying about text a little bit. Thank you.
You want? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, and this was a simplistic contrasting of debate as a primary way to think about academic knowing and dialogue, and then the doing as a way of knowing. You could argue that academics is a form of doing, and what this idea, this critique of academics as texts about text, did not only come from this author I cited. It's also been articulated by Wes Court and the guy who's, now I'm blanking on his name, but he's edited, Peter Ward, has edited a new book on ecclesiology and the importance of ethnography. And clearly we learn from texts, and that's why I said, I spent time using Appiah's notion of theory, and we need that. I'm not saying do away with that. I'm simply calling attention to the fact that academics is a place. So the question of some of these writers is, how does that place, how does that social location, call it an ivory tower, but it still, has social location, and it impacts what you notice and what you don't. So in some senses, I'm making a rather obvious claim. Now, it would be silly for me to argue that all academics have to start now relocating in some, I'm not talking about something simplistic. I'm simply inviting us to ask how academics, its rewards and its penalties shape what we are able to notice and what we are not. And Todd Whitmore has actually writing a book now, where he's being a radical critic of the kinds of blindnesses that come with our social location. Does that get at what you're asking? Yeah. And never are we saying that there's only one good kind of knowing. It's pretending that I could, that I don't, and our Christian traditions call upon us, invite us to acknowledge our fallibility. So this isn't simply some kind of theory critique. This comes out of our Christian commitments. We always need to ask, how is my fallibility shaping what I'm not noticing, et cetera?
Thank you. Lastly, a quick question.
I really appreciate your presentation. One of the things that I really want to propose for us to think about is that actually doing as a way of knowing can be knowing as a way of doing. And one of the things that I always talk about to my students is that a good theory or a good theology is a good practice. And we have to really reconceptualize what constitutes theology or theory or what constitutes doing. So perhaps one of the ways that we have to think about is that to move beyond of our binary thinking to approach theory and praxis or doing and knowing, and we have to move beyond this binary approach and then come up with a more holistic, that the intertwinedness of between doing and knowing and knowing and doing, and combining academicism and activism. That's why I am here. I mean, I'm trying to combine my activism and academicism, and it cannot be separated in a binary way. So doing as a way of knowing, knowing as a way of doing.
Yes.
That's one of the things that you want to propose.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you so much. There will be time after our respondent has spoken at the end also. There will be time for more questions. So do not despair. Our next presenter is, I was told, the pronunciation is, his name is Jochem Huberath. Jochem is professor of dogmatic theology and the history of dogma, as well as director of the Institute of Ecumenical and Interreligious Research at the Catholic Faculty of the University of Tübingen. He has been actively involved in the development of ecumenical thought in Germany for some time, making a particularly significant contribution through his work on the method of communicative theology. He is going to talk to us on communicative theology, a new way of engagement. Jochem, welcome.
15 minutes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present the project of communicative theology. It means in short remarks. It's 5 points, and the first is communicative theology is a contextual theology. Communicative theology is not a theory of communication, and it is not a theological reflection on a separated, limited sector of reality, but is like the liberation theology, regards the reality, includes virtuality, we hear it here, in the perspective of God who liberates his people. And so the communicative theology regards the reality in the perspective of God who is a communicative God. He communicates himself, herself, itself in the history of the humankind. And so the communicative theology did not arise as an abstract theory developed on the planing table and subsequently of theological communication applied in practice. It arose precisely out of the practice of theological communication within groups, almost in small groups, but also in bigger groups. The beginnings of communicative theology go back to my cooperation with Professor Matthias Scharer in Innsbruck, and in the last years we have intensive cooperation with Marianne Hinsdale from the Boston College and Brad Hinsey from the Fordham University. And each year we organized a meeting of the so-called Communicative Theology Research Group, includes professors, graduate and postgraduate students, and theologians who are involved in pastoral practice or in the schools, as a teacher in the schools. This is the context of the communicative theology. The second point, the heart of the communicative theology is living communications in process. Living communications in process. Matthias Scharer and I joined together with the aim of providing guidance and support, not from without, but rather from within, to processes of living learning, in which we ourselves were participating as leaders and sometimes experts. Thus, our engagement followed 3 basic convictions. First, in theology, content and method cannot be separated from each other. The second, in theology, teaching and learning are only possible as a process. And third, in this process, all of participants must be taken seriously as acting subjects of theological communication. I think the first point is clear. Theological statements are not, must be theologically reflected. One can see they must be mirrored, in a mirror reflected, and this mirror is the own biography, the biographical stories of other people, in the experiences of groups, and ultimately it must be reflected against the challenges presented by the globe, the so-called globe. The second point is teaching and learning are only possible as a process. It is clear the theological content of this process is not something to be discovered for the first time. What is discovered, namely the belief in the triune God, has long been present as something both knowable and known, but it becomes my own idea, object, image of faith only when I consciously go forward along the path of which it points, namely when I related it to my own reality and to my perception of reality as a whole. Thus, the project of our first jointly led course in communicative theology was given the title not simply the triune God, but rather in the beginnings was relationship, our communication of faith with the triune God. And the third point, in the present situations of the ecumenical movement, and also above all in the Roman Catholic Church, there is need to give closer attention to the instinct of faith of the whole people of God. If ecumenism is to have a future, it is not enough for church leaders and theologians to listen to each other. In addition, the whole people of God must become involved in the communication of faith. All of the churches agree that in every baptized person the Holy Spirit awakens a sensus fidei, an instinct of faith. In our own time, the concrete development of this instinct of faith has more and more become the responsibility of individual Christians. Thus, more and more forms of shared community along the path of faith become necessary in order that from the individual's believers' instinct of faith, a collective instinct of the faithful can emerge. This sensus fidelium grows out of the sensus fidei of the individual believers, but it also supports the individual sensus fidei. The third point, what is the specific of communicative theology? By no means do we assume in our works that communication in faith always succeeds or that it will always arrive at a consensus. Analogous to the way of liberation theology arose because human beings and whole peoples were being oppressed, the concept of communicative theology arose in a context that, although admittedly far less dramatic, was nonetheless existentially relevant for the survival of the faith, namely in the context of the practice marked by enormous communication deficits, indeed by total breakdowns of communication. Human communication does not need a theological, it is a Trinitarian basis in order to be practiced in a human way. But precisely the fact that the triune God appears here to be so unnecessary, so superfluous for ordinary communication, makes his importance for theological communicatio and communio all the more transparent. God's relationship to humankind is from the beginning communicative. And the Second Vatican Council stated in the dogmatic constitution on the divine revelation, through this revelation, therefore, the invisible God, out of the abundance of his love, speaks to men and women as friends and lives among them, so that he may invite and take them into fellowship with himself. The fourth point, parameters in the communicative theology are dimensions and levels, axioms and options, and I think it is better you read this in details in this book and in this book. This book is the English version of the first so-called Grundlagenband, The Practice of Communicative Theology, with an excellent foreword by Brad Hinze. And this is the so-called Selbstvergewisserungspapier. This is a communicative theology research group, reflections on the culture of our practice of theology. It is bilingual, German and English. I like to underline only 2 points. We operate on 3 levels, and the first and the very important level is the level of immediate participation. And then the level of experience and interpretations, and the third level is then the academic theological reflections. It's very necessary to combine these 3 levels. And our options, I present here only 2 options. At first, the option I cite on. The first is the option for equanimity based on grace in the face of all sort of feasibility fantasies. This is okay, 5 minutes. And the second and the most struggled and sometimes rejected option is the option for standing fast even when nothing goes. Standing fast even when nothing goes. We can discuss it. It is very interesting. The 5th and the last point is communicative theology a new path for ecumenism. Maybe it could be. We do not claim to have intended theology new, nor do we think that we have now found some patent remedy to revive the stagnating ecumenical scene. Nevertheless, we repeatedly gain experiences, even in projects not explicitly ecumenical, that can be made fruitful for ecumenical communications. And 2 experiences in this. In explicitly ecumenical courses, we lay special emphasis on a trialogue. It is an artificial word, trialogue. With this term, we mean the communication between the 3 acting subjects involved in faith, doctrine, and theology, namely the believing people of God, the magisterium in its role of church leadership, and in the academic theology. For ecumenism, it is especially important today to engage all of those who in any concrete situation are currently making ecumenical experiences of life and faith. These experiences of the primary communication, the first level of faith, are what is decisive. Magisterial teaching and academic theology are meant to serve them. In a time when official ecumenism is stagnating and the results of theological studies find little reception, it is important to make clear once again what is really at stake, namely to promote the ecumenical coming together of Christians in ecclesial community. In fact, both theology and the magisterium can learn from the experiences of such an ecumenism. And second, places like Thésée or Assisi are important location, topos, loci, for ecumenical experience and share witness. But it is important that this spiritual ecumenism not be promoted as a form of escape from a difficulty situation, or indeed as a substitute for theological efforts. Theology itself is and must be a spiritual activity. Thus, therefore, communicative theology, as I have described it, must be guided by a spirituality that finds expression in particularly in certain options, like the TCE, the Theme Center Interaction. Communicative theology understands itself as linking the experiences which the individual I and the group community we, thank you, have both in the project of a faith, taking account at the same time of the enveloping globe. So the I, the we, the globe, and the faith are in network in the communicative theology. At a time marked by a growing trend to individualize it, personal experience of God on the one hand, and to a formation of close-off groups on the other hand, it is imperative to direct our attention time and again to the gospel. Theology has an essential contribution to make to the development of intellectual, spiritual responsibility. Repeatedly, we have been privileged to experience now in the practice of communicative theology, communicatio and communio can come alive. When this occurs, we speak of a given we, a given we. That this experience be given again and again in the ecumenical movement is the goal of all our efforts. Thank you.
You still had 24 seconds. 5 minutes, questions of clarification. Yes, the hand at the back, sprinters, please.
Delfo Canceran from the Philippines. When I heard the word communicative, it reminds me of Habermas. I don't know if it is connected with Habermas. If that's the case, then I suspect that communicative theology will only be a communication between or among scholars, theologians, experts. How about those illiterate? How about those poor, marginalized? I don't know if they are included.
This is a question in all discussions about on the communicative theology. I think there are similar intentions, but it's not so the way of resolve the problems is not the same, because the Habermas concept is more a concept for an expert group communication, and our intention is to involve the people of God, the subjects, not only the colleagues and the scholars in this communio. And what is the aim, the goal of the communication? In Habermas, it must be a successful process in the end. And we are conscious that it is normally that communication can break down. And it's not the daily experience that it is also in the ecumenical field, it is successful. And we have from our, in the heart of our faith, the conviction that not only the resurrection, but also the cross is in the heart of our faith.
Thank you. One more. Any more questions? If not, we move on. Thank you. Our third presenter is William G. Rush, and is a Lutheran pastor, and he has taught and written on ecumenical and patriastic subjects. He has also been involved in the work of Faith and Order, several dialogues, and the Lutheran World Federation and the World Council of Churches. Welcome.
I've been asked to speak on the topic, receiving ecumenical thinking outside the box from yesterday to tomorrow, so that's not part of my time. The various elements of the assigned topic for this presentation really disclose a clear manner to take up its contents. These components simply need to be unpacked, but not in the order of the formulation of the topic. Thinking outside the box is often regarded, at least in American English, as a cliche from the business world. It means approaching problems in a new, innovative way, reconceptualizing, even thinking creatively, unimpeded by orthodox, conventional constraints. It seems that this expression was first employed in a United States magazine that I never read, Aviation Week and Space Technology, where it appeared in an article in 1975. If you're curious about the box, the reference seems to be to the box described in Sam Lloyd's Encyclopedia of 5,000 Puzzles, which was published in 1914. If all of this intrigues you, I should point out that in the New York Times, in its February 26th edition of this year, published an article entitled, "When Truisms Are True," which proposed the thesis that the phrase, "to think outside the box," is not a cliche, but that a box or a cubicle is required. Those persons who work, think outside those structures are actually more creative, according to the authors of that article. Perhaps part of the liability of present theological reflection is that it is not done literally outside the box. I will leave the matter there, but just conclude that in the present context, the phrase is being utilized to suggest that our thought as theologians and ecumenists should consider being more imaginative, without addressing the question of whether we physically need to be standing or sitting outside of some cubic figure. Yet recall from our topic that our concern is not just any type of thinking, but ecumenical thinking outside the box. That adjective demands that we focus on the ecumenical movement. If anything about ecumenism has been accurate in recent years, it has been two reactions. First, an unreflected rejection of any verbal form that can be traced to the root ecumenical. And second, when that word is employed, an increase in its fuzziness, so that it means anything from the organic union of churches to mere cooperation with anyone about anything. There's an urgent and pressing need to recover clarity about ecumenism and the ecumenical movement. Indeed, a significant cause of fatigue in present-day efforts for unity among the churches is that they have lost an understanding of what ecumenism is. And that dilemma is not solved by abandoning the word. Ecumenism is and always has been a movement, with all the characteristics of any movement, at times unorganized or at times over-organized, living through crises, occasionally unsure of its final goal, depending on colossal figures, at least as so seen in historical perspective. Thus, ecumenism is not primarily an institution, although it may find institutional expressions. The ecumenical movement may be composed of churches, but it's important to recall in its origin and in periods of its history, the churches were not its leading players or promoters. However, such characteristics as those just outlined are common to most movements. Ecumenism has some features that are peculiar to it and are not shared with similar phenomena. I have in other places attempted to describe these aspects. Allow me here just to repeat some of that content. Ecumenism is conspicuously multidimensional. This conference vividly demonstrates this fact with the profusion of subjects addressed. This multitude of dimensions can be justified, but there must always be the cautionary word that when ecumenism means everything, finally it will mean nothing. Ecumenism's uniqueness is not only found in the fact that it is multidimensional, its peculiarity is clearest with the recognition that at its core is a search for unity, a unity in truth that is found in Jesus Christ. This is a unity that has to be manifest and draw followers of this Christ into a koinonia or communion of faith and love. Such an affirmation does not limit the movement in such a manner that its aspects of education, mission, poverty concerns, race, and social issues of peace are eliminated or minimized. But ecumenism is a search for the will of God in every area of life and work that seeks to discern, proclaim, and participate in the triune God's eternal and constant purpose for humankind and the mission to the world. That definition is an expansion of material that is provided in the introduction to the dictionary of the ecumenical movement. When our title speaks of ecumenical thinking, from yesterday to tomorrow, it reminds us that this ecumenical movement, with its fundamental commitment, has a history. Indeed, within the last 2 years, there have been celebrations of the 100th anniversary of the modern ecumenical movement. The 20th century has been referred to as the century of ecumenism. With fairness, that movement has been able to trace its origins back to the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh in 1910. That history is critical when there is deliberation about the tomorrow in the title. As you may know, that story has often been depicted in posters that picture an on-flowing river or stream. Ecumenism, largely because of the scandal in the 19th century in missionary endeavors of Christians, bubbles up in Edinburgh. It surges on in those early years in conferences on faith and order and life and work. In 1948, after years of preparation and then delay because of global war, those two streams institutionally flow together in the World Council of Churches, to be joined in 1960 by the World Missionary Council. The World Council of Churches is joined then by various regional and national councils around the globe. Then, in the 1960s, the Roman Catholic Church, with its Second Vatican Council, dramatically enters this one ecumenical movement after decades of mistrust and hesitation. This action instills new life into ecumenism and raises to new prominence the ecumenical pursuit, as now exercised in bilateral dialogue. This overview readily discloses a number of significant accomplishments of the ecumenical movement. There is no question that in comparison to the early decades of the last century, many churches are more comfortable with one another. They are willing to place behind them the years of polemic and caricature. They are open to cooperation in many areas that include issues of justice, peace, poverty, and education. They have formally entered into ecumenical organizations, often described as councils of churches. The lists of accomplishments in these areas, globally and in many countries, can be quickly documented. There are equally impressive results in addressing the profound theological issues that caused division among the churches and that kept them visibly apart. Baptism, Eucharist, and ministry remains a fundamental ecumenical text coming from over 50 years of multilateral efforts in the arena of faith and order. Especially since the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, the proliferation of bilateral dialogues between the Roman Catholic Church and other churches, and then a wide spectrum involving indeed even more churches, has demonstrated theological consensus and convergence in areas that once were deemed eternally church dividing. Certainly the impressive results in these areas include the Christological agreements between Eastern and Oriental Orthodox, the Lauenburg Agreement between Lutherans and Reformed, and the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, originally between Lutherans and Roman Catholics, but now a consensus that includes others. The thick volumes of Growth in Agreement, now three in number in their English edition, document this claim. However, all of this yesterday in our title moves us on to consider what can be said about from yesterday to tomorrow. And the last element of that formulation brings us into the present, which I trust leads into the future. What can be done in the ecumenical present that will positively affect the ecumenical future? Here, two things must be said. First, we must recognize and acknowledge that the impressive results of the ecumenical movement to date are fragile. They can be lost, and indeed there is evidence that this is occurring. Secondly, most of these results have not been claimed officially by the churches that have encouraged them. In other words, what is lacking is the receiving in our title, ecumenical reception. By that expression, I mean all the phases and aspects of an ongoing process by which a church, under the guidance of God's Spirit, makes the results of an ecumenical achievement part of its faith and life. A church takes such action, which initially may be a juridical decision, because it sees that such an ecumenical achievement is in conformity with the teachings of Christ and the Apostolic Church. I believe the key to the ecumenical tomorrow is the success or failure of this reception by churches in the ecumenical movement. Do they have the capacity and the willingness, under the guidance of the Spirit, to enter into a process of ecumenical reception? We must acknowledge that there are ample present forces pulling them back from that challenge and opportunity. Yet there are also impulses that should encourage the churches to proceed down that road of ecumenical reception. Ecumenical theology has developed concepts of differentiated consensus and differentiated participation. Both as carefully thought through and defined ideas were not available in the early history of the ecumenical movement. Also, a progress in ecumenical reception of theological consensus or convergence will enhance or promote ecumenical activities in other areas of the ecumenical movement, like addressing hunger and justice issues. Thus, the challenge before the churches, it seems to me, is to take up the question of reception of the work to be done without betraying that central core of the ecumenical movement, which is the commitment to the visible churches of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend. We give 5 minutes for questions of... Yes, Peter? Sprinter.
My name is Peter. Thank you very much, William. You are a very encouraging lecture. I followed the first half with great hope. It's the second half that I am very depressed about. I have in my office all the 3 volumes you mentioned, and I look at it every day because it's right in front of me. And I ask myself, what have we done? We have all kind of consensus documents. They have been received, sometimes officially, and then they fire wonderfully in the corner of some ecclesiastical bureaucracy. On the other hand, on the grassroots level, there are ecumenical sharing, sometimes illicitly, but they're going on all the time. Communication in sacraments, share of Eucharist, share of prayer. It's going on. On the official level, you have all the policy. You can do this, you can do this, all this, and then on the grassroots level, people are doing. And so there is this great gap between what we call theological consensus and official reception, and then on the level of practice. I would like to see if you have some comments on it.
Oh.
Well, thank you for the comments. And let me say, I share some of the frustrations, all right? So we're bonded by that. But I'm not sure I'm all that pessimistic, because I do see, first of all, on the official level, there is evidence of ecumenical reception. Your church, for example, in terms of the joint declaration. Now, could there be more reception? Could we move further? Of course we could. The churches that I know, the church I belong to, hesitantly engages in ecumenical reception, takes certain actions that makes reception more difficult and doesn't think through the ecumenical implications of those decisions. So it's an ongoing challenge and task before us, but I don't think we can give up the hope in doing it. And recognizing, and whether we want to know it or not, that there are many exciting places where the ecumenical movement has already had a profound effect.
Can I maybe ask if we can keep our questions until after the last presenter? Is that possible, or is burning, you'll be restless until you ask? Oh, you will be okay. Okay, thank you. Our last presenter, who is a respondent, is Ellen Padilla, and she is Assistant Professor of Constructive Theology at New York Theological Seminary. Her writing projects include an upcoming book entitled A Passionate God, and an upcoming 3-volume series being co-edited with Peter Pan on theology of migration, and an upcoming essay, The Eros of Intersubjective Becomings. In that word, I don't pronounce it under my breath. Anyway, so let's welcome Professor Ellen Padilla.
we're faced with a dilemma, as Bill Rush posits, with a box. Perhaps as in being ourselves in a box and seeking to get outside of it without rejecting an important cause. Or as in each of us going beyond our individual boxes and yet avoid being boxed in within another box. Either way, it could entail being outside a box that boxes us in, hence seeking to be deboxed. It would mean for us as its contents to somehow spill over and reconfigure ourselves not as a box. Indeed, that will be the impossibility of our task being made possible. Perhaps all of us here, and I among those of the younger generation, recognize that this is quite a serious affair, a needed endeavor to seek this dialogue to debox this movement in union with others, with those who in Edinburgh pursued ecumenicity. So as we debox ourselves without leaving behind this needed ecumenical movement, indeed by refusing to do so, we somehow must find a way to appreciate the newness of the past still unfolding. This will be a most definite yes and veni, veni, Spiritus Sancto, of that which will always remain to come. O Spirit of reception, O free and unbound Spirit, life, energy, and nurturing space, come. We are indeed in this conference welcoming a movement of the Spirit that both gives continuance and interrupts Edinburgh. Even the footsteps that followed of David Duplessis or Mr. Pentecost, a new Pentecost about to fall upon us. These welcoming guides, or spiritus or spirito, ought not be akin to recollecting and regathering of ecumenicity within itself, the capacity to ask the question that turns upon itself solipsistically. Indeed, it seems to me that what we are being called today is to live ecstatically, therefore, in an openness of the self to the other, drawing oneself towards her or him, as Emmanuel Levinas compels us. Neither a sedentary inhabitant nor a nomad, the relationship between the self and the stranger will be a sort of Pentecostal ecstasy through which we breathe and become transcendent in the form of opening up. It derives meaning, but only while in relationship with the other, in the proximity of the neighbor. May we welcome this pneumatism. Of course, some wisdom and guidance has been shared throughout this conference. In this last day more specifically, we're being encouraged by Joachim Hilberath to live out the faith by understanding its meaning and walking in it in relationship with the people of God, that is, church leaders, theologians, and the body of Christ as a whole. This theme resonates with the 1.5-tier principle of diplomacy heard in the opening words of Gerard Mannion and of Paul Arthur's presentation that followed. Particularly in the work of Hilberath, communio and communicatio join as one, as if invoking the memory of Leonardo Boff, who also compels us to join one another trinitarianly or perichoretically to help create a more just society. For why not imitate the manner in which God opens the divine self before the world, inheres it, in order that there might be a greater level of intimate relationship within the divine life and thus societal transformation? Could this level of intimacy within God, within each other, infuse us with a desire to seek the well-being of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger? Mary Fulkerson, it seems to me, would agree that this may be the case. Furthermore, as we include in this paradigm the issues of gender and color. Certainly her words take this endeavor of living out the faith in the direction of the eradication of sexism and racism in our midst, both within and beyond the walls of the life of the church. Tuesday's plenary speakers began to guide us through this precarious path by means of their interrogations. Others throughout the conference have shared similar insights and added to this list the issues of ethnicity, war, sexual preference, poverty, immigration laws, discrimination laws against people of other faiths, and international exchange laws, to name a few. This universal we, therefore, has become quite complex, for it includes the many of the local without erasing the uniquenesses of each. By doing so, we are also drawn near the limit, asked to be adventurous enough to draw oneself beyond the borders of entrenched views that also have blinded each of us thus far. This seems to be the developing impulse driving this conference, the conviction that yes, we should draw the one unlike ourselves near, live out our faith also in terms of seeking its well-being. Thinking through Plato's eyes, if you don't mind me invoking his name, these strangers-like divine beings may appear to cross-examine our history, our very beginnings, our baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. While no eye can endure the vision of the divine, one may welcome these strangers who may be gods in disguise. What other realities, histories, subjectivities in the sense of those things that have been covered over? Sorry, let me start again. What other realities, histories, subjectivities will we find along the way? These strangers may speak of things that are not, but perhaps in the case of those things that have been covered over, and by the very means of our logic, create havoc to that logic, speaking its language in order to transform it into something new, its own language. Would we really want to welcome them? Or would their accents be too strident for our ears? Their interrogating looks too piercing for our souls to sustain. Those whom we meet once we begin to spill beyond the box that boxes us in truly await us. Perhaps another box with its particular set of languages, accents, skin tones, gender, stutterings, and gender preferences too difficult to understand. To befriend these strangers, not just to have them at our table, may indeed be to attempt the impossible. But the Spirit puts one at such risk, drives one to such limits of loving the impossible with much suffering and supplication. The Spirit that Rosh speaks of provokes us, interrupts us, and calls us to the limits of our enjoyment as much as our grieving with the unexpected, like a muffled voice carried by the wind, as John Caputo would say. There beyond the box, the beyond outside the box, the word about our churches of which St. Francis of Assisi and St. Clare became aware in their tumultuous time. The spirit of reception calls us to risk ourselves, perhaps to risk becoming in the shape of another. As Fulkerson and Mary Getui reminded us today, or throughout the conference, this act of proximity would not just spare us to a face-to-face encounter with someone other than the self, so that I might tolerate her, but to truly be transformed by her, to swallow her, to chew her, and without phagocytizing her, be able to let her become a part of myself. For myself to know what it will mean to be her, flesh of her flesh and bone of her bones. Are we aiming too high? At this juncture, we would need to draw from the thought of Latino scholars like Maria Lugones, for I believe that without a resistance to their fictional construction of a vantage point from which unified wholes, totalities can be captured, any ecumenical effort may be in peril of becoming a mere reflection on the narcissistic mirror of the self-same. The vantage point of becoming a mere reflection, the vantage point will remain privileged, simple, one-dimensional. So any conception would appear as a derivative of that which is seemingly unified, so that the unity could grasp any multiplicity, but only by means of sameness and comparison with sameness. The vantage point is outside of, almost otherworldly, the voyeur, an ideal observer that just a few minutes ago we were talking about, almost as if having no symbolic and institutionalized inscriptions in its body. It believes itself to be ungendered, uncolored, non-ethnic, non-contextual, not having an accent, and not having to provide an explanation of its place of origin, as if standing apart from its own multiplicity and what commits it to multiplicity. Could the predetermined rules of the game, the hovering over doxa itself that controls structural models to which Pierre Bourdieu alerts us, be further deconstructed? I dare to say, therefore, that in this conference, an embodied theology, a theology of flesh and blood that scares us truly, may be before us if we look around. For the stranger has already crossed our borders. Let's not be surprised. The often feared arrival of something other than the self occurs in places of dialogue such as this one, at the in-between, at the limits of the box such as those being experienced here and now. It's the limitations, frontiers of meanings, of one's way of thinking ecumenism. As Levinas points out, the stranger may encroach my at-homeness, on my ipseity, on my power of hospitality, on my sovereignty as host. At this point, this stranger may turn, at least in my imaginary, into a hostile subject, and at his hands I might become a hostage, the one in the place of the accusative. This way of truly leveling the landscape may be too messy of an affair. And again, perhaps by recognizing our limits, we become more honest and transparent, more vulnerable, another trait of the spirit of reception. This will also be a step towards deboxing the box with much integrity. But this limit may not, must not be where we stop. For the limit is also a threshold, the opportunity for attempting the new, for novelty to become actual. But how could what has been shared in this panel and conference as a whole bring about a reality of transformation? In what tangible ways can we implement what has been explored as we are getting ready to return home from this site of pilgrimage? How may we debox ourselves, or in a Newanian way, create the free and fearless space where brotherhood and sisterhood can be formed and fully experienced? I close with this prayer. O veni, Spirit of newness, we welcome your Pentecost. With much fear and trembling, we welcome you.
Thank you so much. 5 minutes of questions of clarification, and then we'll have 10 minutes of general questions. Any questions that you want to ask Helene? Or you need time for it to sink? Or are you awake, by the way? You are? Okay. Ask questions. It's open to you. You have the freedom to talk. And we had two. Michael wanted to ask a question, and yes.
Michael Kinnaman from the United States. This really is inviting Bill to respond in some sense to Elaine, if I might. I've participated in the same understandings of faith and order style ecumenism as you, and I admire so deeply the work that you've done. I'm wondering now whether the metaphor that we've used over the years is wrong. The metaphor that really infuses so much of the work that you spoke about is growth. Even the language of growth in agreement, of course, is the title of the 3 volumes. And I'm wondering if that doesn't leave enough room for the working of the Spirit in transformative ways that we just heard about in the response. maybe the results of these dialogues are not simply to lead us into a growth in agreement, but rather to lead us to a repentance, for example, which may not come with a simple metaphor of growth. And it may be that what we need is simply to clear space for the Spirit to convict us of a new way of seeing one another, and that looked at in those terms, we're not simply talking about reception of agreements, but rather the clearing of space in a different metaphor. I'm interested in how you think about this now after all the years of your work in it.
Can I suggest, can we correct 3 questions and then we distribute them, or should we do 1-1? 3 questions. Wait for. You remember your question? Okay, then go ahead, answer it now. If you fear, you will forget. Okay.
Well, Michael, as always, your comments are very, very helpful in these matters. It seems to me when you talk about growth and agreement, and we're quoting titles to volumes here, growth and agreement cannot occur without ecumenical reception. We can't grow in agreeing with each other ecumenically if we cannot engage in the process of reception. And I firmly believe a component in true ecumenical reception must include repentance. It's not only the acceptance of something, it's the acknowledgement of sin and fault that must be repented of. So I think ecumenical reception, as properly defined, can indeed and must include the notion of repentance.
It may not be linear.
It may not be, no.
Who repents? Who is repenting? Who is doing the repenting?
Well, I hope ultimately everybody. I mean, every church involved in the ecumenical movement has more than enough to repent of.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay, hold on to your question, David. Let's go to you.
Hello, Andrew from Chicago. My question, and this is really for anybody who wants to answer it, but can there be a holistic ecumenical movement without a key part including evangelicals? All week I keep hearing of folks whispering under their breaths about evangelicals, kind of gawking at them as conservatives and unrealistic. But realistically, they're a dominant faith structure within the West and within the global South. And to ignore that, I feel, is just to stick our heads in the sand. Pew Research Forum just came out with a statistic that said, at least in America, only 17% of churches in the country are mainline. 83% are more Protestant evangelical, and that doesn't even include the exploding Pentecostalism within the global South. So I continue to hear this week about the other, quote unquote, being represented as different faiths or ethnicities, genders, races, sexual orientations. Not really anything having to do with what I feel is a big monkey in the room when it comes to ecumenicalism, when it comes to the Christian faith in contemporary society today, which is evangelicalism. So what are your thoughts about evangelicals, their role, and how would you suggest engaging them? Thank you.
Who wants to respond to that? Any volunteers, sacrificial volunteers? Okay, as they think about it, can we correct another question there at the back? There's an ecumenical gathering here to discuss.
No, I think it's for all the table. My question is, I'm David from Argentina and born in Colombia. I'm from the global South, and I don't feel that you are speaking about the all ecumenical movement in the world. I feel that you are speaking about the ecumenical movement from the North. And I feel that this presentation, and very good presentation, but our people in our earth is dying. And it's not about immediately things and doing things and resolve problems. But I think if we are here, it's because we need to think in tomorrow. And in a global South, before we speak about we work. And there is other things. other thing that I want to say, that is when we are together, we don't think, what denomination are you? But we receive from the North these divisions, and we repeat these divisions in our churches. And my question is, this is for us, the ecumenical movement tomorrow. This is our future tomorrow.
Thank you. Oh. Okay. Do you want to address those two questions? The first one about the question regarding Pentecostals and Pentecostals and evangelicals.
I don't have an answer, a comprehensive answer for a question. It seems, it's a large question, mostly because the evangelicals are a very diverse group of people themselves. They are not the categories, if we categorize evangelicals as simply being on the right side politically or conservative, I think that we are completely misunderstanding the evangelical movement. There are many shades of evangelicals, and I think that many of us represented in this classroom would agree with that. So, I think that there is then that depending on what are the versions of evangelicals, some that you may feel are not being represented here, that could be the question to ask. What are those perspectives that you perhaps may feel are not being spoken of here? With regards to the question of the South, especially Latin America, and I know that I was just talking to Nam Sung Kang about this. At times we feel that, for example, issues of racism are not issues of the South, or that issues of gender, etc., or issues of sexual preference. But when we look at our society, we really pay attention to what happens in our society. The North is not the only place, and Europe is not the only place that is experiencing these issues that at times we feel like we are all sort of in one agreement. But that's all that I would like to say. I think that we also have to question our own context and become clear that there are issues that while they may not be the same, are issues that we must also address. Whether it is from our own contextual perspective, then I agree with you. Then it will have to be from our own contextual perspective that we address these issues. But I think that the issues, many of them are there as well.
Thank you. Since we are dwelling together in common, are there some evangelicals from the audience that would like to speak to this briefly? Oh, you asked and you want to answer? Yes, okay, you want to answer your own question? Okay. Yeah, yes, we have Nansung, and then we have Yera down there. If you want to comment it first, and you. Nansun.
I want to address the questions that you raised. Where is he? He disappeared.
He left.
He left? Because I have been organizing a kind of international world conference, and I have been begging the evangelicals and Pentecostals to join us. And but I have been refused. Because so it's not like the ecumenical bodies is not inviting them, but it's opposite. They are refusing to join us. And also in many countries, for example, South Korea, the evangelicals and Pentecostal churches are most really richest churches. And they have financial resources and power. And this word ecumenism becoming sort of F word, it's a kind of taboo that they don't want to hear the word ecumenism because it has been so misrepresented. And it is the word ecumenism is becoming like a communist party. So I was asking a kind of support for our meeting in Korea next year. And then first question that I was asked is whether the meeting has something to do with WCC. If it is, then they will not support our gathering. So the question that I want to ask is that, it's not the ecumenical movement, it's not inviting the evangelicals or Pentecostal, it's opposite. We are ecumenical bodies and movement are rejected by the evangelical and Pentecostal groups. So how do we communicate one another? That's a really big issue.
Thank you. Yela, you wanted to speak to that?
Being an evangelical, I wanted to say to my fellow evangelical that I feel welcome here. I think the problem that has been mentioned is a true one, but I do agree, and I just said it to my neighbor also, whispering, maybe 70% of many evangelicals wouldn't even want to come to this meeting. I do realize that. But the question is also indeed, would many ecumenicals, so to say, be willing to go to evangelicals and explain them what they are and who they are, and the other way around? I think there is indeed a need for bringing the two movements more closer together, and being young, I am still optimistic, and I think that even though after 100 years there were two movements after Edinburgh 1910, one in Lausanne and one in Edinburgh, I hope it can get better.
Okay, one last comment, because we are running out of time, and we will need them to at least to wind up if they need to say something before we leave. Yes?
Okay, yes, gracias. I have a comment, and my name is Carmen Nenko Fernandez, and from the United States, from the invisible population of the United States, the Latinos and the Latinas. And I guess I have some concerns about what I've been hearing, because any engagement that is respectful of social locations or otherness or claims context at some point has to be respectful of language and who is present in its company. And in our company are evangelicals, if you looked in the back row, and in your company are Latinos and Latinas from the United States and Asian Americans from the United States. And we don't really enjoy hearing derogatory language mentioned in an assembly that is not an educational moment. There are words we would not use about different denominations or people, and yet they were used in this assembly from the plenary panel. And I think if we're going to talk about educating ourselves ecumenically, and what about the interreligious folks that we have in this room? We have representatives from Islam, we have Jewish brothers and sisters here, yet our prayer is increasingly Christian. We have men and women, and our language in prayer is male. So if we're going to talk about what people in our pews are doing, maybe we need to talk about what we do as theologians and how we use our language and how we exclude too. Because I have to tell you, coming from the United States, I could have had this meeting in New Jersey. It's in English. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. There was one last, you'll be restless until you speak. Okay.
Ray Helmeke, to keep caught on to who I am now. Boston College Jesuit, very Roman Catholic, therefore. And I wanted to say a word of defense for evangelicals. It is my Northern Ireland experience. One of the groups that was most urgent about the peace, had most to contribute, was called Ecumenical, the Evangelical Contribution on Northern Ireland. Now, here were people coming to things that are among the most basic concerns of any of us who regard ourselves as of the ecumenical movement. For them, ecumenical was a bad word, but their activity was among the most useful. I think also of people like Glenn Stassen, about, who's the fellow who runs the Sojourner, in the United States, that there is sometimes they're described as the evangelical left, but they are people who have tremendous contributions to make within the evangelical community. And I think as ecumenical types, all of us, Catholic, Protestant, need to be talking with them and talking with them very respectfully. I find, speaking out of a Catholic context, when I hear about problems of reception, from the Catholic side, these problems of reception are at the top. And those from the top seem to be most concerned about the maintenance of institutional power. That seems to be one of the things that has to be very central concern. I can see Peter very restless here.
Thank you so much. This is 1 minute past 4. Can we get 4 last minutes to give our presenters the last word? You have, Elaine, do you have last word to say?
I want to start by apologizing if I said anything about evangelicals being labeled in a particular way. I was trying hard to try to not categorize anybody, but if I offended anybody, my apologies.
Thank you. William, do you have last word? Joachim, do you have a last word?
In the perspective of communicative theology, it is not possible to have the last word.
Thank you very much. That's a good reminder. Mary, do you have, okay, semi-last word.
I may not have, were you all talking about the pejorative terms that I named as part of, but I was trying to expand acknowledgement of forms of ethnic racism and so forth.
It describes the violence, just like Americans would never use the N-word, coming from a panel.
Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, you know, I've been criticized in other contexts for only talking about racism as blackness versus white privilege. So I was quoting a Latina. I'm sorry.
Can we still, do we need a Mpamba reconciliation ritual again? No. You are okay? You can handle it? Okay, let's just create room where conversation can continue so that we really have a better understanding of each other and the better language for each other. Please, let's give an applause, clapping of hands for the presenters. Thank you so much. Is it coffee break? What time do we come back? 4:30. We come back.